Very nice. Dear friends, dear colleagues from far and near, welcome to this conference on synchronism. This is in fact a sequel to a conference on synchronisms in the plural that we are having as part of a series of royal colloquia, which I started many years ago under the auspices of the royal family of Romania. And last year, we wanted to consider this phenomenal interest in Romania for this discussion about synchronism. It has a history of 100 years. The synthesis on synchronism was published precisely in 1924-1925, the 3-volume work by Eugen Lovinescu. But it was already building on an obsession that was quite old in Romania. It had led to a different solution in the 1860s, 1870s, when the conclusion had been that, yeah, it's great to imitate, to not emulate Western models, but sadly, the result is always forms without substance. You can build things that you call institutions. They look like institutions, but they are not. They're empty forms. And there is no content that can be locally produced. And we are doomed. That was basically. And this is why they were embarking on a critical reappraisal of all traditions, all previous contributions, with a kind of negative assumption or presupposition that everything goes down the drain anyway and everything is hopeless. Now, in 1924-25, Lovinescu thought that there was a possibility of breaking this, circle of doom, or of this vicious circle of imitation, or if you want, of it was just. Can call it emulation, but that would be too much. This is not even mimetic competition. That would also be a lot. It's just imitation. He was pleading for imitation. And he thought that there was something, only he was writing in 1924, 1925, retrospectively already. He was talking about the Romania of the last 30 years of the 19th century. And little did he say about the fact that in the 1920s, mid-20s, let alone the 1930s, another synchronism was being more successful. And that was not a synchronization with the values of Western liberalism, but rather a synchronization with the values of, as we say today, illiberalism, including fascism, Italian fascism, German Nazism. And he didn't say much about that either. So that is an endemic discussion that has been continued after in the most unbelievable conditions after World War II, when another synchronism, which was imported from the Soviet Union, came to us and was introduced rather, I would say, forcibly, not only in the philosophical, literary, cultural debates, but also everywhere else. It was introducing a Soviet model, a top-down mutant form of synchronism, which was then becoming a system. Yeah. Now, I chose for the poster of this conference, an image from the International Exhibition in Paris in 1937, which, in my opinion, is a form of synoptic representation of what was on offer in terms of synchronisms in 1937 around the world. And it is a rather interesting thing that everything is there on this image. You have the Soviet Union, of course, offering a form of synchronism, fascist Italy, you have Nazi Germany. They are all offering a model. And in between these great models, which are present simultaneously, synoptically, you could find the pavilions of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including the pavilion of Romania. So it turned out that actually there was a synchronism that was already winning ground, and ultimately turned out to be, to be taken up in Romania and used for. And this time, this conference is the first official activity of the Academia Europeea Bucharest Regional Knowledge Hub, the foundation of which was decided. The documents were signed yesterday with the board of the Academia Europeea and with the leadership of the Romanian Academy, so we are in business. We hope to be, and I salute our staunchest supporter along this way, long road, David Coates, who is the executive secretary of the Academia Europeea, who was with us all this way, and I'm very glad that you are here, David. And thank you once again. Thank you very much. In fact, this is a situation in which many members of the speakers in this conference are also current members of the Academia Europeea, and I hope some of them are future members of this body. Now, tonight, I would like to give the floor first to Dragoș Paula Ligică, who is a corresponding member of the Romanian Academy, who actually had this crazy idea about a year ago or so to launch a national cycle of conferences on synchronism in Romania. It was his idea. It was embraced by the leadership of the Romanian Academy. And thus, over this past year, there were many such events, mostly national. There is an international one going on as we speak in Sibiu, with our colleague and friend Diana Mishkova giving a keynote address. Due to the fact that infrastructure is not really synchronized in Romania today, she cannot make it from Sibiu to Bucharest in time for her to speak. There are no direct flights, and then the train ride it means whatever, basically. So I would invite Dragoș Paula Ligică to talk to us about revisiting synchronism, charting the conceptual territory, and updating the theoretical apparatus. Dragoș, you have the floor.
So in many respects, I'm going to simply build up on the opening remarks, Sorin's opening remarks. And in many respects, we are going to continue a conversation that, as Sorin has mentioned, we have started internally in the Romanian context about 1 year ago, but also a couple of other conversations that we had, including previously today regarding this topic. So what I'm going to do is simply to chart the territory of the theme of synchronism, and to take a look from the perspective of the broader conceptual apparatus, the theoretical frameworks associated with the concept, and then look at some of the implications for the current research agenda and applied agenda of this topic. So the starting point of my approach is a quote from Sorin in presenting the event. As you could see, he has outlined a series of concepts that we are associated with this notion of synchronism. And definitely it's a very broad area, but there are some underlying themes, and those underlying themes which are uniting these concepts like modernity, modernism, imitation, transfer, stigma, utopia, liberalism, economy, society, cultures, there are some underlying themes that I'm going to use as a vehicle in order to make a step forward in charting this territory. And those themes are as follows. So the first thing is that we are talking here about a pattern. Even if we have taken Lovinescu and Gabriel Tard as starting points for Romanian conversation regarding this topic and its implications, actually, we are talking about a general pattern. It's a pattern which emerges not only in the relationship between countries at the center and periphery, but also between countries at the center when they try to catch up and they are in a process of emulation and competition. So the structure is more general. So whatever we are going to say in our explorations today and tomorrow, and in general in this discussion about Romania used as a case study, has very important implications in terms of understanding the past dynamics of these phenomena, the present, but also the future. And that would be my last part, the last part of the conversation. So this is the first thing. The first thing is that you are not talking about just one specific case study, one country, one history, one pattern, but a structure of patterns which have something in common. The second thing is that when we are talking about this issue and this set of concepts associated with synchronism, we are talking about actually two things. On the one hand, we have synchronism as an explanation, an analytical structure, explaining stuff. It's about what it is and what it is not, and the way that is evolving over time. And the second one, very interesting, is about what should be done. And this is a normative aspect of it. So I take these two things as starting points. And based on that, I'm going first to the basic text of the Romanian approach. Again, because my understanding is that if we take different case studies, we'll discover similar patterns at work. But in the case of Romania, the starting point of our views on these things have been framed by this author, Gabriel Tard, and his theory of the laws of imitation, end of the 19th century French sociologist who articulated a position which was focused on the bottom-up individualist approach to sociology as opposed to Durkheimian approach, holistic, top-down organistic theory. So he's articulating this position on the analysis of social processes and the analysis of social change in which imitation and indeed innovation, but in a larger measure, imitation is crucial. Eugen Lovinescu picks up the Romanian author, who is actually the pretext and the founding father of this approach in the Romanian context, picks up this book on the laws of imitation and converts that not only into an explanation of the modernization of the Romanian process, but also into a doctrine, and to use the label of synchronism for that doctrine. It's not just about how things are happening in the modernization process of Romania, but also about how things should be in that process. So it's a two-step approach. And now, with that understood, we have now our goal. So our goal in the rest of my presentation is first to understand better this structure, explanatory structure, which has two dimensions, positive and normative, analytical and applied level, so to speak. Second, to identify the larger class of family theories, models, which might be associated or should be associated up to a point to this initial analytical insight developed by Tard, and then look to the potential limits of this approach and to the potential of this approach, especially in the light of the new challenges of the 21st century. Because again, this is a theoretical structure, at least in the context of our specific Romanian conversation. I get to this again and again. It's a 19th century theory, and we are in 21st century, so we need to see in what measure and how far it continues to have carry capacity. Therefore, this is an outline what is going to happen in the next 20 minutes or so. Let's hope that I'll be able to make it even less. So first of all, I'm briefly going to go over the variety of theoretical frameworks that we could associate now in the 21st century, looking back to the initial synchronist framework. Then I'm going to briefly take a look at the normative problem of synchronism, which, as you may expect, brings the very important philosophical problem of deriving a should from is, so from analytical structure of diffusion theory, and imitation theories to derive what should be done correctly and effectively. So this is a normative problem. Then I'm going to briefly discuss a pathology of the normative thinking in diffusion theory, which is conversion of synchronism into an ideology or a ideological political propaganda doctrine. Finally, I'm going to turn to the future and see what is the capacity, the capability that synchronism has currently in the 21st century to continue to provide both an analytical framework and a normative orientation to our approaches. So let me start with a positive explanatory theory. And again, it's in a sense arbitrary because I'm coming from a specific angle in social and administrative sciences to this conversation. So I'm sure that we'll be able to, in the next couple of days, while discussing this, we'll be able to add additional theoretical perspectives and framework to this core. But I have identified two concentric circles of, or I have identified, maybe I am proposing at this point as a way of enhancing our understanding of the initial framework. So obviously, you look at Gabriel Tarde, you take a look at the structure of his argument, and then you take a look and see what happened afterwards, or maybe about the same time, in social sciences that might be adding up, bolstering, complementing that type of approach. And then you could see that he articulated a pretty solid framework. So imitation is a fundamental social mechanism. There is an imitation, invention, dynamics. There is a logic of social propagation. Then there are some laws of diffusion or propagation. And then he looks at the tensions between the resistance to change and the change set up into motion by the laws of imitation. So we have pretty much enough material there to start looking around and to see what are the other theories that might help bolster, develop, elaborate this structure. And obviously the first of them is the diffusion theory of social change and the social interactionist theories, because those are, in my view, and I'm going to briefly explain why, are the first level, the first layer, the first vicinity of theories, both historically, but also analytically, that we could associate with the basic intuitions behind Tarde's theoretical framework. So just briefly, because again, I'm just pointing out, I'm just showing diffusion theories. We associate them with Paul Lazarsfeld, for instance, and we are associating diffusion theories with the classic standard text, The Diffusion of Innovation, Rogers. And I haven't mentioned network theory, but network theory is emerging in a sense in a convergence with these types of approaches. So we have diffusion theory, which is an approach which, in a sense, elaborates sometimes without even quoting Gabriel Tarde's intuitions about how ideas are diffused. We have a structure, and a structure which starts with idea or the knowledge, then the persuasion, decision, implementation. The most important thing here is that this type of approach is opening up the black box of cognition and decision making in a way which is much more substantive and socially and psychologically, scientifically articulated that in the case of the first generation theory, the Tarde theory. And with that opens up what we mentioned here with two branches, the social interactionist, meaning-making theories, symbolic interactionist, because in those circumstances of diffusion, such micro-level processes are taking place, but also then you have a bottom-up process of emergence of structures based on these micro-level interactions, and I have pointed out to Thomas Schelling's micro-motives and micro-behavior as a typical work which is articulating those insights. So you could see, this is the first layer, diffusion theory, and this bifurcated approach, which is looking at the interactions at the micro level, first of all, to understand how the micro structure is organized in these types of interactions, but then look at the outcome at the macro level with micro motives and structural consequences. Second layer, it's memetics and evolutionary sociology in my interpretation. So memetics is looking in a much more systematic way in a framework which is using Darwinian evolutionary theory of how memes, bits and pieces of ideas and information are circulating, are evolving, are competing, and are surviving in various environments. Evolutionary, so I have obviously Blackmore and Richard Dawkins as sort of exemplary authors for this type of approach. And then we have a different type of approach, which is looking at the institutions as structure. So this is more like a top-down approach. And the nature of evolution and the evolutionary nature of institutions in different environments and the way they are able to compete, survive, change in the dynamic of social cultural processes. So Boyd and Richardson and David Sloan Wilson are representatives for this type of Darwinian approach extended from biology and the surrogate for a sort of a genetic approach, like in the meme theory, extended to social institutions and culture. So this is a sort of synthesis of the first stage of my charting the territory. So let me see. So this is so we have the structure of the various schools: symbolic, diffusion theory, memetics, evolutionary sociology, and sort of comparative understanding of what is going on when you are putting these things together. But most importantly, and something that I haven't stressed, because again, I want to go as fast as possible to cover the territory. It's just a superficial mapping of the territory. Most importantly, all these things are bolstering the initial Gabriel Tard approach to the laws of imitation and what is set into motion by thinking in terms of those and applying those. And one of the things that is set into motion is the normative implication of that. So we are going to look now at the other facet of synchronism. Synchronism as something, a doctrine that says something about what a society or an organization or a community should do. And here you could see clearly that on the first column, we have the laws of imitation, the descriptive ideas, the description of ideas spreading, and a sort of general theoretical sociological framework. All those are descriptive. So we call them the sociology of change. We could call them laws of imitation, a theory of diffusion. Doesn't matter. The idea is that it's an explanatory structure. On the other column, we have the doctrine of synchronism, which is about a normativity, what societies should do, and in this case, imitate the West, and a series of prescriptive projects which are derived from that very idea. Here, in this case, we are raising serious concerns about using the relationship between description and prescription in a normative way without carefully looking at how you build a bridge between the is and ought. It's a fundamental problem in philosophy. It's a fundamental problem in political philosophy and social philosophy. And I think that we should be very careful in this case of how we are going to derive the normative conclusions from the descriptive theories, whatever the label, the structure, or the way we are framing them. So the bottom line, and again, I'm just synthesizing a longer discussion, is that imitation is not a source of normativity. The value of the substantive items, memes, issues, themes, which are diffused and are circulated, which are adopted, is the one which is decisive. The fact that something is imitated or widely diffused doesn't say anything about the normative content of it, other than that it was able to survive and to be effectively diffused in a system. So what drives normativity is not the mechanism of imitation, but the intrinsic moral, political, ethical, aesthetic value. And that's an important point to make. Normativity follows content, not mechanism. So this is crucial in any way of framing this type of approach, irrespective of the circumstances. So what is important is that normativity is derived by the content, not by the mechanisms in which it is. So imitation is a channel, not a compass, and very, very important, because if you are not paying enough attention to this very sensitive issue of normativity, you are getting to the main problem, which is synchronism becoming a propaganda and ideological tool. And the next stage of my presentation, and I'm going to try to be very brief at this point, is simply to draw attention to the fact that the doctrine of synchronism as a normative objective has been converted, and there is a temptation to convert it into an ideological tool. So instead of inviting a critical analysis, both of the facts on the ground and the possibility to derive from those facts implications for policy action and apply action, you are simply using it as a rationalization for justification, some of them retrospective justifications for political or social decisions and processes which have nothing to do with it, a moral weaponization, so drive a line between good and evil using the pretext of synchronism, and geopolitical simplifications at its worst, like for instance in the case that sort of meaningless and under-conceptualized distinction between East and West, black and white, good and evil, in a very rudimentary framework. So why this matters, again, I try to synthesize what is supposed to be done with synchronism as a doctrine, diffusion theory as an analytical framework on the one hand, which is on the left, and then the diluted function, which is then converted in propaganda on the right hand of this table, which is, again, might be justified in terms of propaganda and politics, but in terms of pure normative analysis or positive analysis, it's not a contribution. So we have seen the three uses of synchronism as positive explanatory theory, as normative theory, and we have also seen what, at least in the context of Romania, and this is the reason we have started this conversation in Romania 1 year ago, the third use of it, which is simply as a propaganda and a framing tool in the context of the Romanian political, ideological, cultural debates. Now I'm moving to the last point, which is the future of synchronism. And I think that in this respect, things are intuitively clear. First of all, synchronism has a problem when the paradigm of modernity is collapsing under our own eyes. When you don't have a very robust Western Europe as a center of diffusion and unchallenged, unique center of diffusion processes, you have a problem with a synchronist, at least in the classical structure. Similarly, the technological changes, the social changes, the demographic changes, cultural changes at the global level, and a multi-cultural, multipolar world with different dynamics complicates, if not undermines, substantially the classical synchronist model. I'm adding to that the fact that, for instance, currently China is proposing a technologically driven new types of governance structure and economy, which is a very serious rival to the Western model of advanced industrial and post-industrial democracies. Technological leapfrogging is possible. In such situations of rapid technological and social change, it is possible from the periphery to occupy an evolutionary niche. Now we're talking the evolutionary framework, and manage to generate a situation similar to what Japan has managed or other Asian countries have managed in the context of high modernity in the second half of the 20th century. It is possible. Given the fact that it is possible, that again is an element which is undermining the synchronist perspective. Finally, there is the cultural resistance, especially in the context in which identity politics has become something more than simply identity at the level of the Western industrial post-advanced democracies or post-industrial democracies. Identity politics, especially in the case of countries with a different culture or religion from the Western core, we like it or not, has become a very important factor in the current circumstances. So we might expect that phenomena which are described, for instance, in Eugen Lovinescu's the tension between modernist liberalism and the Romanian traditionalists to take different turns in new circumstances. So all in all, the original formula by Eugen Lovinescu and other authors in the 19th and 20th century, who were playing with these ideas, was grounded in a world where modernity had a center, and which a certain stability existed on several parameters, which allowed a very simple, robust explanatory structure for social change, and at the same time permitted a deviation of a normative model. This is not the case anymore. What is left? What is left is synchronism as selective adaptation. in a field where you have different ecological niches and different competitors, selective adaptation of different strategies continues to be a good way of describing some synchronous approach to things, or at least to justify still using the logic of synchronism and the logic of diffusion. Synchronism has interoperability in a global system. When you have a polycentric system of different governance structures, institutions, cultures, and so on, synchronism might still be working as a way to make interoperable the various diverse units of the polycentric system. And there is the issue, which is a facet of the previous 2 points, or the sort of corollary of synchronism in a multi-value landscape, operating in ways in which is assuring interoperability and selective adaptation. 3 scenarios for the future of synchronism. The first one is somehow it stays pretty much in the similar structures that we are familiar with, but that means that the radical changes that we are seeing around, somehow we converge to an environment, a structure of the global system pretty similar with the 19th and 20th century. This is very unlikely. The second one is that synchronism simply loses entirely its relevance when confronted with a new landscape. And finally, the scenario which I think is most likely, synchronism persists, but in a way which is different from the classical version. So it's something that has to do with navigating plural, uncertain, and contested global modernity, post-modernity. It's a way of navigating also the polycentric nature and a way of organizing the interoperability between the very diverse and dynamic units which are going to define the institutional, cultural, social landscape of the future. So let me stop here. This is a brief attempt to just touch the tip of the iceberg and setting up the stage for the rest of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dragoș Paul Aligică, who is also a member of the Academia Europeană. I should mention that, not only of the Romanian Academy. Yeah, this was an attempt to map the field of the discussion of synchronism and somehow overcome the contextual limitations of the Romanian discussion of that, which in fact was even more limited than that, because although Lovinescu tried to use a sociological model, he was a dilettante reader of sociology with very little background in it, applying it to a time that had already expired and looking around for inspiration. That's Paul wonder then that most of the time Lovinescu's theory became a literary theory, and then if you want at best a kind of cultural studies theory, and thus most of those who are still discussing it in Romania, and this last year we could see it in action, insisted on the aesthetic and then vaguely social, aesthetically social dimension, without grasping the complexity of this. The other thing is that Synchronism 2.0, which was advanced here by Paul Dragoș Aligică. Yeah, it is there. It was always there, because there was always a choice of synchronisms, even in the 19th century. And this was underestimated in the general discussion of Romania, as it was the, let's say, horizontal synchronism in between the various poles or centers of Western modernity, because Western modernity was already plural, and various forms of Western modernity were emulating, were criticizing each other, growing together in a a rather difficult process of entanglement, which was never clear for everybody in this game. So this is true, of course, in terms of intellectual history. That is quite clear, history of ideas. So clear in terms of sociological theory, development theory, theories, historical theories. That is something we should remember. I now ask Balázs Tencsenyi. He's from the Central European University in Budapest, and also Vienna, who is going to talk to us about the discourse of crisis as synchronism. Tomorrow, at the end of the conference, we shall have a discussion of his latest book, which deals with this issue. And I thought that it would be good in the beginning of our conversation to have him talk about that. So, Balázs Tencsenyi, the discourse of crisis as synchronism. Balázs.
Thanks a lot. So I actually finished this book about crisis and crisis discourses, and I thought that it would be interesting to connect it conceptually to the problem of synchronicity and how these two concepts are talking to each other. And I've basically found, while trying to think it through, that it's of course a very longue durée conversation. I mean, if you look at the book of François Hartog, the latest one, Chronos, then he is actually making a very interesting argument about the very beginning of the Christian regime of historicity being somehow constituted by this tension in a way of crisis and synchronicity. Think about the in a way temporal gap between the first and the second coming, which on the one hand is historically is a historical continuum, whereas in sacred time it's basically there is no historicity, or like there is a kind of overlap, synchronicity between these two events. And basically in some ways the crisis that is being the second coming, the last judgment, is somehow a kind of like concentric point around which this is organized. And then in kind of in a way historical time of the Christian Middle Ages is also very much about task of synchronization. Yes, I mean, like it's basically the attempt to somehow put together biblical history with pagan history, and then once again how these two work together. And then in the early modern period you have on the one hand a kind of attempt to create some sort of more homogeneous time, also in physics, Huygens, and the whole story of the two pendulum clocks that are hanging from the wall and are synchronizing with each other when they are kind of linked to the same point of kind of connection. So I mean, like there is a certain kind of like attempt to create a spatial and temporal synchronicity, and that will be, of course, expressed by classical philosophical projects, like think about Hegel, where you have, of course, a kind of universal temporality, and crisis is by default synchronic. But then you can also have alternative project, and that will be, of course, continued by Marx in a projected on an economic sphere mainly. But then you can also have counter projects to this. I mean, Gleichzeitigkeit is a key concept in Kierkegaard's philosophy. I mean, Samtidigkeit, I think, in Danish. And there it's basically the whole point is that historical phenomena that are very far from each other are actually gleichzeitig. I mean, like the moment of a Christian believer of Kierkegaard's time meets the Gospels, basically, and this is actually on the one hand a kind of synchronicity, like you all of a sudden step out of historical time and enter sacred time, but at the same time it's also a crisis because there is a certain kind of insecurity of knowledge based on this encounter. So there is an anxiety whether you are actually understanding what the Gospels are telling. So basically there is a kind of like prehistory to all that we are talking about. This story doesn't start with positivism, and positivism is already inheriting a pre-existing very complex story, also conceptual history of these notions. And now when we go to East Central Europe, then of course it has its own story, which I think very much gets I think, radicalized with the late Enlightenment, when there is this kind of, in a way, spatio-temporal distance from the normative West as the core of civilization. I mean, this is the main chronotope of the Eastern European Enlightenment. Yes, that like basically there is a kind of spatial and temporal sequence where the center is in the normative West, and then you can actually turn the spatial and the temporal distance into each other. So like the further you are in space, the further you are in time. Yes, and the kind of Polynesian can be read as Homeric as well. Yes, so those who are far from Paris in space can be also translated in distance in time. And then this, of course, is a huge challenge for Eastern European intellectuals, because, I mean, they are far, yes, I mean, like they are clearly in an asynchronic relationship with the West. And then when romantic political projects are emerging, they are actually trying to overcome this challenge. And the way they try to overcome is that exactly going back to sacred time, so like going back to Kairos and Crisis. And basically, I mean, this is Tobiansky or Mickiewicz's whole Polish romantic construction, Christ of the peoples and all that. Basically, belatedness can be overcome with a salvation story. Our own self-sacrificial suffering, which is actually a kind of suffering in historical time of belatedness, can be actually a synchronizatory move to basically get out of the chronos and become part of some sort of sacred time. And then you can have basically this also in late romantic discourses. Eminescu, for example, is talking about kind of a perspective of eternity where you can suspend basically historicity. And I mean, he has this very paradigmatic formulations. I mean, I will not read it in Romanian now, but in any case, I mean, like you have a possibility to step out of continuous time through some sort of kind of sacralization of time. Now it's interesting that when you get into the anti-romantic, so basically positivist critique of this romantic construction, then these anti-romantic traditions are reinforcing diachrony. So they are rejecting this kind of sacralization of time. Crisis is precisely due to mistaken synchronicity. This is the accusation of Junimists in Romania and Krakow positivists in Poland. So they are saying that exactly an inorganic catching up, an inorganic synchronization, a fake synchronization creates the crisis. And this is to a certain extent also kind of becoming a master narrative of the second half of the 19th century. And this is actually the context from out of which Lovinescu tries to get out. So this is the crisis of the positivist political discourse. If we don't want to go into the Romanian context, you can look at parallel discussions in many East Central European countries. I chose very shortly Masaryk, who I think is actually arguing very similarly to Lovinescu, in the sense that he's talking about basically the crisis of Czech politics. I mean, he has actually a book or kind of a pamphlet with the key notion of a crisis, which the crisis is basically the desynchronization of the liberal nationalists with our times, yes, with the present. So he's basically saying that like there is a kind of cleavage between the present and the kind of liberals, and basically the solution is actually to kind of return to a present-oriented historical consciousness. I mean, he's basically saying that only that history matters that is connected to the present. And this is, of course, very, very similar to what Lovinescu is arguing. And of course, I mean, this is the same intellectual debate where Durkheim and Tard and many other, Spencer and many other positivist intellectuals are part of the kind of horizon of intellectual references. Now, basically, that discourse is going on at the turn of the century, but then in the interwar period, there will be huge transformative moments. I mean, we are usually arguing, I mean, in these books that I have been editing and working on, I have been always arguing that there is a kind of second Sattelzeit from the early 20th century onwards. So like basically a whole temporalization, not only of individual concepts, but the whole temporalization of key political notions and political languages is changing. And I'm now very shortly showing three spheres cultural crisis, economic crisis, and political crisis as three spheres when this kind of interaction between the crisis discourse and the question of synchronicity can be followed. I mean, if you look at the cultural crisis, I mean, of course, cultural crisis is a discourse that is the most sensitive to the question of temporality. This is already there at the end of the Second World War, or if you want to argue even in the late 19th century, I mean, think about Nietzschean constructions, but then it kind of is amplified at the end of the First World War conceptually and also in a way quantitatively. I was looking at the concept of crisis also a little bit like quantitatively, and it's very interesting that 1917, 1918, it booms everywhere in Europe. Until then, it's much less projected on the whole European state of affairs. And in Western cultural crisis discourse is very much about the collapse of European spatial temporal centrality. So exactly this Enlightenment hierarchy that I was talking about is questioned. First World War becomes a kind of demonstration effect of the crisis of evolutionary vision. It's not true that there is a kind of linear, homogeneous time which is kind of progressing. I mean, the First World War becomes a kind of experience of kind of not progressing, or the progress actually being self-contradictory, and that is actually connected in the end of the First World War in like writings of Paul Valéry or Spengler or Ortega or others with the emergence of non-European others, both America and the East, offering more dynamic temporality than Europe. So basically, Europe gets desynchronized from progress, basically in both directions. And two other temporalities, Americanization and Sovietization, is becoming a kind of alternative temporality, which is considered to be more dynamic than the European temporality. This is also amplified by the fact that from the 18th century onwards, synchronization as a concept is very much connected to the idea of zeitgeist, both in the French tradition, like Voltairean tradition, and also in the German Herderian tradition. And basically it means that the time itself has its agency. And then this means in the kind of interwar period that if the time is actually getting desynchronized with itself, or progress gets desynchronized itself, then it's actually the crisis becomes synchronic. Yes, that like basically if the zeitgeist is actually an actor, then the crisis of the zeitgeist means a kind of synchronic crisis everywhere. Yes, so basically it's not just crisis somewhere, but crisis everywhere. And of course that poses an interesting question for the East Europeans. Are they synchronic with the Western crisis or not? And that will create different possible directions. The liberal and moderate conservative criticism, actually many Romanian readers like Lisi on the wall has been writing about this as well, are actually saying that, wait a second, exactly because we are not as modern as Western Europe, so we are not synchronic with Western Europe, and that's why we are not synchronizing with the Western crisis. So Spengler might be true for Germans, but he's not true for Romanians. Yes, I mean, Romanians still have a couple of decades to progress in order to reach that kind of civilizational point where they will actually be able to reflect on themselves as being over-civilized, and that's why entering the crisis, that we are not yet there. Yes, I mean, that is one possible argument. The other and more radical anti-modernist argument is actually taking it the other way around. It says that this crisis is actually a chance of synchronization for the Eastern Europeans. So it's exactly not the asynchronicity that saves us, but this kind of crisis of the West, the collapse of historicism, which Eliade, for example, is talking about, basically makes the stages that were the kind of positivist progressive vision completely meaningless, and it is possible to kind of have this jump into the sacred time where we are actually going out of this kind of gradual modernity that has been the kind of paradigmatic narrative of this positivist and post-positivist discourses. And here you can have then these national ontologies, which are basically synchronicity, this kind of putative synchronicity is assured by erasing diachronic altogether. So eliminating historical continuity or eliminating historical diachronic history altogether and entering secret time. In Eliade's case, this is basically overwriting the history with the ritual repetition, circularity. In the case of, for example, Bulgarian Naiden Shaitanov, he is actually talking about a kind of radical Gleichzeitigkeit, that any historical moment is in the same historical moment. Yes, so like it doesn't matter whether we are talking about Byzantine history or 19th century, it's the same kind of historical, ahistorical or suprahistorical matrix, and you can jump between these things, like basically like in a you can have this kind of transversal jump from one historicity to another historicity, because diachrony doesn't matter. There is no historical continuity whatsoever. Now on the radical left, there is also some sort of discussion about this. For example, Georg Lukács, he's kind of in a way arguing about along the Marxian idea of crisis. That basically crisis is about a destructive process which made the unity of seemingly separate but still interlinked phases, like for example buying and selling, supply and demand, visible. So like basically the Marxian original argument is that exactly the asynchronicity shows us the real synchronicity, and basically Lukács is making the same argument, but not only just about economic dynamics, but about basically any kind of cultural dynamics. And then of course this then translates into an aesthetic debate, relationship of objective and the subjective, and for of course Lukács, the subjective reactionary bourgeois analysis can be objectively true. So 19th century like Balzac's criticism of bourgeois society can be synchronic with the Marxist criticism, even if Balzac was actually an anti-bourgeois reactionary, because his objective criticism is true. Whereas for the perspective of the avant-gardists like Brecht or Benjamin, who are criticizing Lukács, synchronicity with the crisis means that the adequate form is fragmented. Yes, so exactly when you are entering the crisis, then you cannot create this kind of holistic form, but you can only express synchronically the crisis with crisis-ridden aesthetic tools, for example, montage. Yes, so exactly non-holistic, and that will be the debate in aesthetic debate. Now, the economical debate is also very interesting, because basically crisis, I was finding this in my book project, that economic crisis as a concept is basically very much downgraded, and at the turn of the century nobody uses crisis because there is a more scientific language which is about economic waves and conjunctures, and basically crisis is left for the amateurs as a notion in the 1910s and 1920s. There is a kind of more scientific meta language, and of course this conjuncture literature and wave literature is presuming global synchronicity as a starting point. Here the world crisis of 1873 is of course an important kind of experience. And some of the theoreticians are thinking about agrarian cycles as the basis of this kind of global waves. So I mean, and that would be, of course, very relevant for Eastern Europeans, because, of course, Eastern European economies are agrarian economies. And then crisis comes back as a concept with the Great Depression. So like then it's simply unavoidable to conceptualize crisis, because the whole public discourse is very much about crisis. So the notion comes back. And here, of course, Eastern Europeans are in a very tricky situation, because on the one hand, there are some special phenomena. I mean, like the agrarian crisis, the agrarian scissor is markedly specific. Yes, I mean, like that basically the industrial prices are growing in a different way or falling in a different way than agrarian prices, and that hits the Eastern European economies in a very specific way. So they have a huge discussion whether Eastern Europe is synchronic in the crisis experience with Western Europe. This is also in the context of a huge debate launched in French symbolic geography or kind of economic geography, but then having huge repercussions everywhere in East Central Europe about the different Europes. So there is a kind of idea of Europe A and Europe B. So basically a kind of agrarian Europe and industrial Europe. And then while some of the original arguments are about the synchronization of Europe A and Europe B, so that basically there is a kind of convergence of the two, and this will be the argument of some of the liberals. I mean, not only Lovinescu type liberals, but also some of the early economic liberals. But then there are also other guys who are coming from the same discussion, like we are in Romania, so I can mention Mihail Manoilescu, probably the most interesting theoretician, who says that there is no chance of synchronization, that there is a self-reproduction of this kind of dependence between A and B, and the only way for Europe B to basically kind of reach some sort of economic development is a kind of anti-liberal corporativist economic project. So exactly desynchronizing from the West is a chance for survival. I mean, this is early Manoilescu in the 30s. Later on, when whole Europe turns totalitarian, then he realizes that actually there is a chance to synchronize with totalitarianism. Basically the radical anti-modernist option in the 1930s, in the late 30s, will be similar to what I said about cultural anti-modernism. So basically arguing that agrarian economy might be potentially more resilient than industrial modernity. So we are not, they forget the fact that in the early 30s, their idea was that agrarian economy was more vulnerable. And because of this kind of there are also historical reasons, like, for example, integration into the German clearing agreements. So basically late 30s actually for Eastern Europe is a relatively good time in terms of economic growth, being able to sell their agrarian products on the German market. So they start to kind of talk about resilience of agrarian societies. And this is the moment when many of the agrarian populists are shifting into a kind of para-totalitarian discourse and opt for the concept of peasant state. So peasant state would be a kind of desynchronized alternative Eastern European type of political organization, a kind of peasant totalitarianism. And that is a kind of synchronic measure with the German and Soviet totalitarianism, but kind of translated into an Eastern European way. Now, as for the political synchronization and crisis relationship, of course, in the 1920s, there is a feeling of synchronization of liberal democracy. We always forget that in the early 20s, there seems to be a complete consensus that there is only one game in town, and that's liberal democracy. We always look at the interwar period from the perspective of the collapse of liberal democracy. But if you ask people in the early 20s, if they were not in Hungary and not in Italy, probably, maybe Bulgaria is on the edge, but most of the other people would say, most of the other experts would say that liberal democracy is the Wilsonian, this is the Wilsonian moment, that liberal democracy is the kind of normative model for politics. And this is a kind of moment of synchronization. And then there is yet another moment of synchronization with the autocratic zeitgeist as a response to the crisis somewhere in the early 30s. So 10 years later, if you ask the same observers or experts, they would also argue that there is only one game in town, but that's exactly the anti-liberal game in town. So there are two moments of synchronization, but two completely incompatible moments of synchronization. Now, as for the liberals, when they are reacting to this, the irony, and this is the, how to say, the dark side of the previous paper, that exactly because of this synchronist ideology, the liberals are becoming almost completely defenseless from the autocratic projects. Because, I mean, exactly if their whole argument at the turn of the century was that there is a normative West, even if they are critical of it, even if they have their kind of ambiguities about it, but basically there's one direction of development, and the direction of development is basically to synchronize with the West. Then when the West becomes anti-Western or becomes kind of anti-liberal, then the liberals have this kind of very ambiguous relationship, because then if they follow their idea of synchronization, then they have to become anti-liberal. And this is exactly what some of the guys become. I mean, the story of Romanian neoliberalism, I mean, like Manoilescu is one of the key doctrinaire ideologists of neoliberalism and ends up being a fascist economic expert. Yes, so I mean, like, it's basically in a way this kind of synchronization with the totalitarian modernity. Now, very interesting is that if you want to look at how the Western European liberals are reacting to this kind of anti-liberal zeitgeist, then one of the main strategies, and we shouldn't forget about this, is exactly conscious desynchronization. So, for example, if you look at the British liberals like Ernest Barker and others, they are actually valorizing British anachronism. They are saying that it is true that in Europe there is totalitarianism, but England is English people are kind of typically anachronistic. They stick to their kind of old-fashioned customs, including democracy. Yeah? So basically the idea is that exactly we are not catching up with the European modernity. We don't question that there is a kind of European zeitgeist which is totalitarian, but exactly asynchrony saves us. Now, Eastern European conservatives, some of the Eastern European conservatives also opt for this asynchronicity discourse or desynchronization discourse. Some of the Christian existentialist or personalist thinkers or people who come in the 1930s from a conservative Christian position, they opt for this kind of the asynchronicity discourse. And for example, also on other intellectual levels, you can have this argument. For example, Hungarian conservative intellectuals like Gyula Szekfű, who's the main Hungarian historian of the 1920s. And in the 1920s, he's quite radically conservative and quite anti-Semitic. In the 30s, when he becomes anti-fascist, he's basically saying that Hungarian nationalism went wrong because we synchronized with Western nationalism. If we actually stick to our 19th century kind of nationalism, that was a more inclusive nationalism. It was not ethnocultural nationalism, it was not the French style, a kind of unificatory, homogenizing nationalism, but it was a kind of inclusive nationalism. And exactly synchronization turned us intolerant. If we were staying with our own nationalism, we would have been actually much more tolerant and inclusive. And you have also the agrarian populist crisis discourse, which is actually also about the asynchronous with the West, but it's trying to recover alternative regional synchronicities. So this is like Milan Hoxha, for example, who is arguing for a kind of Eastern European peasant federalism, or László Németh in Hungary, quite similar arguments. And then in the radical right, the last configuration, basically, the crisis of transformation means that totalitarian revolution is projected into the future as synchronization. Yeah? So basically, like the totalitarian right-wing discourses and also left-wing discourses are basically projecting a kind of future synchronization, and the revolutionary totalitarian revolution is exactly this crisis moment, which converts as a kind of rite de passage the political community, homogenizes, in a way, murders anybody who doesn't fit into the political community, and projects this kind of homogenized community into the future. And this you can find in a sacred discourse like Iron Guard in the Romanian case, but also some of the communist narratives are quite similar. So if we want to kind of take a kind of general picture from this, I would say that the seeming Wunderwaffe of the liberal project turning the conservative criticism upside down. So this is the Lovinescuian synchronicist argument, trying to turn the crisis of acceleration into an advantage, proved self-defeating. So basically this argument of the liberal synchronicist argument that is actually projecting the synchronization with the West as the kind of normative framework becomes very, very problematic when the West becomes anti-Western. The anti-modernist regime of historicity opens up the possibility of overrunning the liberal synchronicity, and liberals had very little weaponry to defy it in facing this illiberal zeitgeist. And then, of course, this is, I think, interesting for us in the 21st century when we have the United States also turning into an anti-modernist direction. Yes, so like many of our kind of typical liberals in East Central Europe were arguing until now that, you know, we have a normative West which we have to kind of follow. Now the question is, which is the normative West that we are following, of course. And I think in this perspective, if we look back to the interwar period for intellectual, I don't know, strategies or intellectual advice, I think we shouldn't underestimate desynchronization as a strategy. So I mean, like, rather than kind of trying to all the time catch up, maybe the strategy of actually thinking that exactly being in a different phase might help us might be actually a real good strategy. I mean, like it's a very funny observation. We talk a lot about this with colleagues from Serbia, that in Hungary and in Serbia, basically the same anti-systemic disappointment of the society against of the regime, or against the dysfunctional state. So something similar that feeds now in Romania Simeon and fed Trump and fed Brexit is now feeding the pro-democratic forces. Yes, so there is a certain kind of similarity of the kind of populist backlash against the dysfunctions of the state, and in different contexts, these might have completely different political. Exactly because these are desynchronic. In Hungary, there is 15 years of autocratic regime, so the anti-systemic kind of disaffection is actually pro-democratic. And that this was something that European Union was not understanding in Belgrade for a very long time. European Union bureaucracy was kind of supporting Vučić as the stable, systemic leader against the non-systemic. And the other possible direction is that I think looking back to the interwar period, there was an attempt to kind of rethink crisis as a creative category, like crisis not just as a kind of doomsday. I mean, like actually what I found in my work is that most of the crisis discourses were actually much more reflexive than we think. These were not just about, the collapse of civilization. These were actually about renegotiating intellectual positions and rethinking intellectual positions. And many of these liberal and socialist crisis discourses in the interwar period were about offering a regionalist and supranational alternative synchronicity. So trying to go against the illiberal zeitgeist by creating kind of localizations of synchronization, not for the whole world, not for the whole kind of cultural universe, but for certain political groupings. So this is what I said about, like, for example, Hoxha's agrarian regionalism, but you can find socialist and liberal regionalisms as well, which are kind of trying to synchronize between certain, for example, Central European discourse is similar like that. And I think this, if you look at the Second World War discourses or wartime resistance discourses, then these are very much about creating a new historical starting point. So crisis is about restarting, actually reflecting on the fact that there is a rupture between past, present, and future, and actually, in a way, thinking about the possibility of resynchronization in the future, but not completely utopian future, but some sort of kind of future that can be negotiated by different political forces. Think about the Ventottene Manifesto in Italy, which is a kind of, again, European regionalist project of wartime resistance intellectuals. So I would say that in this respect, basically crisis and synchronization can come together as this kind of future-oriented collective, in a way, cultural, intellectual, political project to try to synchronize, not with the present, but with the future. And of course, all these discussions about Anno Zero, like the beginning, restarting after the Second World War, are having this element as well. So my kind of actualization of what I'm trying to say is that probably the way out from the current crisis, if we have any kind of intellectual dialogue with the interwar period, is actually to rethink whether we are able to turn the crisis moment into some sort of kind of future-oriented synchronism, but not necessarily a kind of imitative synchronism. Yeah? So the point is not to kind of try to find our normative West with which we are trying to synchronize, but we have to have a normative future with which we want to synchronize. And that is, I think, a much more creative and I think in some ways much more interesting project than trying to find which model, whether it's Singapore, United States, Germany, or whatever, is good for us in Eastern Europe. I think like the way interwar and wartime, this kind of, let's say, counter-hegemonic democratic projects were running, be it Polish or be it this kind of transnational agrarian or be it the Italian anti-fascists, they were actually trying to think about themselves as being able to project a future and not copy somebody else's future. And I think this is my modest, how to say, proposal to try to think about whether you can synchronize in a localized way, not copying, but actually projecting a kind of collective future for others as well. And that, in some ways could also go back to what I started with, the romantic discussions about whether you can actually go beyond this kind of chronotope of distance from a normative West. So, I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Once again, this is Balázs, also a member of the Academia Europaea. Yes, in the period that Balázs was focusing on, which is basically the interwar period, there is, let's say, the equivalent of what in Europe was developed in the 18th century about space. There is a kind of qualitative diagram of time that is being developed around Europe everywhere. And I would see it as a kind of temporal equivalent of the symbolic geography emerging in the qualitative differences between various segments of Europe under the concept of civilization. I think the lessons from the 18th century encouraged people to look more into the diversity of temporality. That is the intrinsic diversity, heterogeneity of time and history. In the 19th century, there was a lot, and in the 18th century, of course, even more, an interest in something that was uniting, unifying, developing together a common sense of time, temporality, historicity. Whereas this experience especially of the 18th century, of the 19th century, is encouraging people in the period where the crisis discourse becomes dominant discourse in Europe to look into the internal diversity of time, temporality. Yeah, thank you very much. Now we go extraterritorial, and then we invite Matthias Midel from Leipzig out there. Matthias, thank you very much for joining us. I know you are busy and overcommitted. Eduardo Tortarola just told me before starting the conference that you have always been overcommitted, and I understand. I know he knows that from before 1989. But I can testify to your life after, let's say, 92, 3. You are already over. Thank you very much. So, Matthias Midel, conflictual synchronisms. Matthias, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Sorin. Can you hear me, or is?
Yeah.
Okay, seems to be okay. Thanks for having me, and apologies for not being physically present in Bucharest. I would love to have been, but commitments, as you said, have hindered. Let me start with a confession. I have really to confess that a certain foreignness of that language of synchronism and the underlying diffusionist theories, but also to the language of center and periphery. And I wondered a little bit why, and I will give you two reasons. One is I'm more interested in discussions of the late 19th century as well as subsequent debates about the discovery of global connectedness and the permanent daily life appropriation of external cultural elements, instead of simplistic diffusionism, which seems to be the basis. And I'm very grateful for the first contribution laying that out again, the theoretical foundation of this synchronism story. And the second one is that Leipzig is a difficult place to speak about center and periphery because we were always both. And we had changing positionalities in that regard. Are we West or are we East, etc. So I'm not so clear saying here is us and there is the normative West, or we are the normative West and they are there. So these are some difficulties. But to contribute at least a small piece to that history of ideas, I will start with an at least temporarily local Leipzig thinker. the philosopher Ernst Bloch introduced the formulation of the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. And he has spent some years of his intellectual career in Leipzig after 1945. However, he had already considered the problem of non-simultaneity in a book published in 1935, in which he asked himself the most pressing question of that time, namely how National Socialism in Germany was able to prevail and to win the massive support by German population. His thesis was that there was a tension between material modernity and the attitudes of the population towards this modernity, which needed to be investigated empirically and explained politically. So there is no synchronism of the overall situation, but there is also this non-simultaneity in his wording between how people perceive things and how things are at the material side. Synchronism, therefore, does not occur by itself. It is not a consequence of some mysterious historical laws working behind people's backs, but a result of political struggle in a given place and time. Synchronism thus also eludes an unambiguous prediction by theorists who claim to recognize historical laws better than ordinary people. Bloch returned to the problem in Leipzig in the 1950s, now in confrontation with the dogmatized Marxism on the one hand, and as a part of a group of unorthodox Marxists dealing with the problem of decolonization on the other. It was again a time where prognosis failed, in this case about the successful overcome of colonial legacies. Bloch's departure from Leipzig in 1961, shortly before the Berlin Wall was built, proved that the tension between those who saw themselves in the possession of the historical truth and those believing in contingency and the unpredictability of synchronization was only fruitful for a very short period of time. I do not want to delve into this question of theory building here further, but rather turn to a question derived from the assumption that there is synchronization, or at least the perception of such a process. And as a consequence of this process, there is also synchronism, or at least the perception of synchronisms. I'm less concerned with the characterization of the societal situations resulting from synchronization, but more concerned with the question, who are the actors of this synchronization? To start with, in my mind, a distinction must be made between two levels of these actors' activities. On the one hand, it is about the production of an idea of synchronism, and on the other hand, it is about the synchronization of political, economic, social, and cultural conditions. And I would like to briefly illustrate this with two examples. In the spring of 1789, the crisis of the old conditions in France was unmistakable, and between May and August 1789, the idea of a radical change in society towards popular sovereignty and freedom developed into a coherent program. This program was nicely expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which took up many ideas from the North American debate and postulated in the most universal language possible the equality of all people, male of course, before the law, and a whole series of rights that could be derived from this. The reference was to France, but the whole world was addressed, and the wording was not national but universal. The fact that a fundamental dispute then broke out in France's most profitable colony, Saint-Domingue, as to whether slaves should also be included, was successfully suppressed and ignored for 2 years in the constitutional debates of the National Assembly, until the uprising in the Caribbean became highly visible. Just 1 year later, France was forced into a war against the European coalition. The question of whether something similar to Paris was possible elsewhere left the writing rooms of individual intellectuals who primarily used the new medium of the daily newspaper and were addressing both a local and transnational audience. The literature is full of authors, pamphlets, and ideas that were fascinated with what happened in France and proposed variants of synchronization for their own places or larger spaces. And we know these hundreds of books about the French Revolution and its impact on the Caribbean, on Romania, on the British Isles, etc., etc. Where the legislation on the colonies and the war likely to help synchronization? Some hoped so. The French Republic granted honorary citizenships and declared its solidarity with insurgents from Mainz to the Mediterranean, and later also to Port-au-Prince and Bogota. But Robespierre also warned, where freedom comes on the bayonets of foreign troops, it has no chance in the long term. In fact, not very much synchronization happened, except for the small occupied territories by the French troops during the time until 1794, and in the learning process that was inspired by the war and its necessary mobilization of resources. The French mainly learned from the British how to run a fiscal military state, and some Austrian reformers took inspiration as well. So I will not go into all these details. But as we all know, Napoleon ignored the lesson formulated by Robespierre, and after spectacular successes of synchronization in many kingdoms, he gave to his family members and generals, he experienced his Waterloo. Had the finally victorious coalition of Prussians, Russians, Austrians, and British synchronized more successfully than the liberal camp? At first it seemed so, and people in 1815 were frustrated about that to some extent. But one or two rounds of revolutionary upheaval later, the picture was quite different. Liberals everywhere now referred to the dialectical legacy of the revolution of 1789. Freedom and constitution, yes. Social radicalism only within the limits permitted by property rights, but at least without slavery. Opening up to industry and urbanity, but marginalization of communist fantasies of a transnational community of workers. 1848 was a watershed in this regard, but I will leave it out here since the decisive moment for synchronism came a little bit later. Around the commemorative year of 1889, the narrative of the victory of freedom, first won in 1789 against the Ancien Regime, was established. The theorem of inescapable synchronism celebrated its success. This synchronism referred to the French Revolution, but its material basis was the emergence of the global condition, which comprised both intensified connections across the globe and the emergence of the nation-states as a way to regain control over these flows of goods, capital, people, etc. To summarize this very briefly told story, Condorcet, Robespierre, Toussaint Louverture were much more skeptical about the possibility of trans-regional synchronization than the violence-prone Napoleon. But even he eventually had to reflect on his failure at St. Helena. In contrast, the historians Jules Michelet, Jean Jaurès, Alphonse Hollard, Albert Mathiez were far more successful in retrospective synchronization and have inspired several generations of historians to date to place the Atlantic Revolution or even the global entanglements of the revolutionary era at the center of what is probably the most powerful world history narrative. Even in China today, no one thinks it is too early to comment on the global impact of the French Revolution. Synchronization can be reconstructed as an activity at the historical moment itself and by the actors of that moment. And then there is a second layer, synchronization by those developing powerful narratives, which work especially well when synchronizing a seemingly fragmented world in the light of a long-lasting development is necessary. My second example, 2 centuries after 1789, a strange coincidence of memory and real upheaval developed that once again raised high expectations. Because the wave of national liberation movements washed away the strangely transnational construct of the Soviet Union, and because the world order of the Cold War came to an end. The impression arose that 1989 was an Eastern European event. Within this region, there were intensive interdependencies and also an attempt at synchronization in the sense of a shared desire to belong to the West, to become the West, or at least to be no longer bound to an alternative path of development which was perceived as imposed. The standard of synchronization seemed clear. However, it became quickly apparent that the radius of the global moment became much larger than the initiators had imagined. South Africa, Chile, China, Ethiopia, and the entire Horn of Africa experienced spectacular upheavals. India, a quieter but also profound reform. And we could even the USA with its intentional deindustrialization. It is only in the light of Trump's policies today, which seek to reverse some of these post-1989 processes, that we perhaps now realize that the US, and marginally also the UK, became part of a massive reordering of the world in economic and social terms. Not unnoticed, of course, but largely unrelated to what happened in 1989 elsewhere. However, all these movements beyond Eastern Europe have remained on the periphery of attention because the actors of the revolution of 1989 were not primarily interested in synchronizing the many variants of the dawn of a new world order, but could be observed globally, but concentrated on aligning their own efforts to the standard of a perhaps also idealized Western development. Does this not correspond to an important part of the attitude that we initially observed after 1789? With the important exception that in 1789 there was no external benchmark against which to think about synchronization. There is no need to exaggerate the analogy, but the wars in the Balkans over Iraq and Syria or over Afghanistan were probably also intended to serve this synchronization, or at least to secure it. But in retrospect, they did not prove successful. I'm not sure if this is the Napoleon moment in the story, without the genius of Napoleon, of course. The synchronism of 1989 is no longer particularly effective. Eastern Europe is deeply divided. The rise of right-wing populism indicates the success of criticism towards naive and diffusionist models of westernization. The permanent search for ever new Cesuras, for the tomorrow beginning transition to an expected new world order, indicates two things. The glamour of 1989 is fading, and there is still dissatisfaction with the level of synchronization achieved. One could also say that the actors of 1989 missed an opportunity to overcome the fragmentation of the world. But wasn't it also the case that the actors of 1789 were far less successful here than the ex-post synchronizers at their desks in the later 19th century? In this respect, the history of synchronization remains as open as it has always been, or at least most of the time. The history of synchronization as it happened historically is much less coherent, straightforward, and free of contradictions than the synchronization worked out by intellectuals years or even decades post festum. There are good reasons to distinguish them and analyze them along their own logics instead of confusing them. Thank you.
A member of the Academia Europea. He is one of the figures of the International Commission for Historical Sciences, and probably one of the Eastern Europeans, very few he was then an Eastern European, Matthias. He was looking at the historical changes of 1989 while working on a doctoral dissertation on 1789. So I think 1989 got him thinking even more about synchronization and desynchronization. And the context Matthias offers is not just this temporal historical context, 1789, 1989, but also an attempt to contextualize this as a global and universal form of event. Matthias, as we all know, runs the European Network of Universal and International, what is this, NUN, European Network of International, Universal, and Global History, trying to negotiate the various forms in which we think of the world, of the entire world, in these different philosophical, epistemological concepts. Thank you once again, Matthias. next year in Leipzig, we should continue this debate, I think. Thank you very much. Now we move to the last presentation today, which is by Joop Leersen on modernity and discontent. Thank you very much for being with us. I know you know Bucharest, and but maybe there will be some time to synchronize what you know about Bucharest with the realities of Bucharest. So thank you very much. It is about modernity and its discontents. Please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm delighted to be in this company. And it's been a learning curve, like the experience that Matthias referred to, synchronism. When I looked it up, I found an article in Wikipedia on synchronized swimming, and I realized that wasn't the same thing. So it was a learning curve. And as I understand it, it is a way of coming to terms with the uneven distribution of modernity. And the notion that imitation and diffusion are always asymmetrical processes between active emitters and passive recipients. And this asymmetry, given the background of the concept, is very often framed in East versus West terms, though people try to universalize it. What I would like to add to this is an attempt to do a comparative history of ideas, a comparative cultural history. I'm going to try and share a PowerPoint with you because in doing a conceptual history, I rely on abstractions that need to be visualized. So let me go to the sharing possibility of my Zoom. Sharing is not turned on. So I would like to request the possibility of sharing my PowerPoint for this meeting. I think somebody at the hosts will have to turn that on for me. To fill the time, yeah, thank you. I think I can now share. What I would like to share is this. Can you see my title page? Very good. I'm taking my cue from Bruno Latour, who from within Paris said, "We've never been modern." I would like to try and work on a type of meta discourse to understand synchronism in terms of the response to an uneven distribution of modernity. And as a literary historian, I am very inspired by Latour's actor network theory. And as the actors in these exchanges of ideas, attitudes, and paradigms, I would like to stress the importance of books, which are things which emerge from a very specific spatio-temporal setting, but which exercise their influence far and wide beyond their place of origin and beyond their moment of incipience. And what I would like to offer also is a point of view from another European periphery. I like Matthias's comment about Leipzig being somehow ambivalent, whether it's in the center or in the periphery. This is something I would like to thematize further. Where is a center? What is a center? And I'd like to take William Butler Yeats from the opposite end of Europe as a counterpart to Lovinescu. I'm going to give you a few quotations from Yeats. He won the Nobel Prize in the year before Lovinescu started working on synchronism. They were both part of that moment when, if you like, the disenchantment with liberal democracy was setting in. Pace Balázs, there was a spreading disenchantment with the Wilsonian moment. People were looking to Mussolini more and more. And Yeats was a very, very early sympathizer with fascism and with what he termed a heroic mode of looking at history. He had laid the groundwork for his Nobel Prize in Literature with launching an Irish school of literature. And the founding essay of this, he voiced the anxiety of possibly being part of the decadence of English literature. So English literature was being fin de siècle, was being decadent, and he was trying to innovate Irish literature, counter-cyclically as it were. And he asked himself, Are we not perhaps merely a little eddy cast up by the advancing tide of English literature, and are we not doomed perhaps to its old age and coming decline? On the contrary, I affirm that we are a young nation with unexhausted material lying within us in our still unexpressed national character, about us in our scenery, and in the clearly marked outlines of our life, and behind us in the multitude of our legends. So I think a lot of the things that I heard about synchronism are at play here. We are looking at different stadialist moments, one for English literature, which is in its old age and decline, and one for Irish literature, which, although it shares the conditions, the time, the language with English, is at an earlier stage and still has youthful vigor. Yeats himself explained this in terms that he borrowed from Giambattista Vico, not from Lovinescu, but it's an ambient discourse, and it's one that I would like to explore a little further. The discourse, the repertoire of ideas of the uneven distribution of modernity. This is how he saw the modernity and the innovative potential of Irish literature 10 years later. In an article on the Celtic movement in 1907, he wrote this: "The Celtic movement comes at a time when the imagination of the world is as ready as it was at the coming of the tales of Arthur, that is to say, in the high to late Middle Ages, preparing humanism and the Renaissance and chivalry, as ready as it was at the coming of the tales of Arthur for a new intoxication. The reaction against the rationalism of the 18th century has mingled with a reaction against the materialism of the 19th century. And the symbolical movement, which has come to perfection in Germany in Wagner, in England in the pre-Raphaelites, and which has fired the imagination of D'Annunzio and Ibsen, is certainly the only movement which is saying new things." Now, Wagner, the pre-Raphaelites, D'Annunzio, Ibsen, bien étonné de se trouver ensemble, but at the same time we see that Yeats is trying to capture a fin de siècle feeling as being innovative and saying new things to the imagination of a world that is in need of, if you like, re-enchantment against a Weberian disenchantment. And the interesting thing here is if you look at the spatial distribution of those names, the innovation is coming from the peripheries. So Paris, London, those places are clapped out, and Yeats was very inspired by the fact that Maeterlinck was Flemish, that Ibsen worked in Norway, that Chekhov worked in Russia, which at that time was considered backward as well, and that Dublin could be part of an avant-garde in Europe rather than being part of a provincial backwater, a backward periphery. So the periphery can be the avant-garde. And he's really turning things on his head here. This is a literary model which at the time was being worked out by the Russian school of formalist scholars in literary studies, the Opoyat school around Yuri Tynyanov, saying that you could see all of literature as a system with a center and a periphery, and that the center consisted of conventions and of a canon, whereas the periphery was either backward stuff or else avant-garde experimental stuff from where innovation was coming in. And there was a dynamic two-way system of exchanges between center and periphery. So if you like, the dynamics between center and periphery were already conceived of as being much more complex and much more dynamic than a simple notion of the center is progressive and the periphery is lagging behind would lead us to believe. Now, to go to a third mode of doing synchronism in Ireland, in 1916, the poetry of Yeats found its political application, and there was a revolt against British imperial rule in the middle of the First World War in the post office in Dublin. This became later on the founding moment for the Irish Republic. And Yeats saw here a moment when modern Irish history tapped into the old heroic sagas. So he, this is in red the lines of that he wrote about the insurrection in Dublin's post office, a very modern, middle class modernity. What's more modern than a post office? The leader, Patrick Pearse, summons the spirit of an ancient Celtic warrior, Cuchulainn, and his statue is on the slide. It's now a statue in the post office commemorating the rising. And Yeats writes, when Pearse summoned Cuchulainn to his side, what stalked through the post office? We Irish, born into that ancient sect, but thrown upon this filthy modern tide. Now here is a drastic discontent with modernity. We can escape from modernity, from the filthy modern tide, by channeling ancient warriors and legendary heroes in order to inspire our own insurrection. And it's ironic that Yeats is now counting as one of the great poets of modernism. Alongside Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, he is one of the great modernists. But he denounces the filthy modern tide. And we see here a return to the heroic primitivism, which also drove him into the arms of Mussolini and Italian-style fascism in the 1930s. So here is, if you like, an Irish counterpart to things I have heard said about what was happening in Romania and in Central Eastern Europe, which are obviously, therefore, much wider. And I think it would be very difficult to, you can try and capture it in synchronism, but what I would like to do is to look at it as a chronotope. I'm approaching this from the methodology of imagology, or also called intercultural hermeneutics. And it has a long-standing, it's been around for about 60 or 70 years. It's been studying many, many literary texts and has come up with what we call ethnotypes, that is to say ethnic stereotypes and structural constants and variables in those ethnotypes, such as the ethnotype of the Celtic Irish, or of the Slavic Pole or Russian, or of the warrior Hungarians, or of the Romanians. And one deep ethnotypical structure is certainly that modernity is made in centers and peripheries struggle with modernity. It's a stereotype, it's a cliche, but it's around everywhere. It's a very deep metaphor. And they work both ways functionally. The place where modernity is fabricated is the center. And if that is the theater of Bergen in Norway, where Ibsen is active, well, then that place, even though it's geographically peripheral, it becomes a central place for the, modern European theater. And whatever happens to be timeless or backwards, that we can define as a periphery. And that means that the repertoire and the discourse of center-periphery cliches is the very definition of a word already used by Balázs in his presentation. It's a chronotope. And I use that in the sense as Mikhail Bakhtin has used it, as basically the plastic distribution of temporalities in space. And in trying to discuss synchronism in terms of a chronotopical repertoire, I want to look at the idea of European modernity, or Europe as a locus of modernity, and what is the periphery. And I'm taking also for my cue things that came out in the 1980s. When I was a student of these things, I was thinking of Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History, which is a very interesting notion that outside Europe there is no history, that type of cliche. Or Johannes Fabian's classic study in anthropology, Time and the Other, the notion that if you go to New Guinea, the Papuas still live in the Stone Age. That idea that moving out of the center is traveling back in time. I want to discuss briefly in my contribution for this workshop what I call the condensation of Europe, and it'll be very broad brushstroke. I'll be going over 2,000 years twice. We begin in classical antiquity, and we go to a pre-1300 European self-image, where Europe sees itself against its defining others of barbarians, nomads, and later on the Islam, in a central axis of civility, which goes first at Athens and then Rome, Constantinople, where the institutional self-image is that of being governed by legislative assemblies and a law-governed state, and where the notion of domesticity, or the oikos in Greek thought, characterizes an ordered society as opposed to the unordered roaming and trackless and a social world of the barbarians, the nomads, and later on Islam. Even in 1100, 1200, we see writings where Cicero and Livy are evoked to say that civilization progresses from the forests to the arable fields, from keeping cattle to tillage and to agriculture, from there to villages, and from there to cities and the rule of law. This classical stadialism is at work even in the High Middle Ages. And the others are obviously people who are nomadic. And that could be Bedouins, it could be Mongols, it's a very deep layer of Eurocentrism, the opposition against barbarians. Something happens around 1300. After 1300, after the Great Schism, the othering of Constantinople and Orthodoxy, the incursion of the Ottoman Turks into southeastern Europe, and the driving of the gradual driving of the Saracens out of Spain in the Reconquista, we have a new axis of civilization which runs roughly from Rome, not to Constantinople this time, but by way of Florence and Paris towards London. The defining other of this Western Europe is Oriental despotism. It is a phrase that people pick up from Tacitus, whose writings are rediscovered in the 15th century. From classical Roman republicanism, and the Oriental despot is first the Sultan in Istanbul, later on the Tsar in Russia. As long as he's in the East, he's Oriental, he's despotic, and Orthodoxy also becomes an other. The institutions that define Western Europe's humanist and Renaissance self-image are the art academies and the universities. Both of these establishments that come from after the Great Schism of Europe. There are no universities east of the axis Vilnius, Prague, Venice. So it's something that is particular to the Roman half of Christendom, and it defines a humanist and Renaissance self-image of Europe as being an area of artistic and intellectual inquiry and humanism, and a rediscovery of classical antiquity. A little later again, around 1600, the axis shifts again. It has to do with the Weberian moment of Protestantism and the work ethic. And we have a new axis which runs again from London, but not now to Paris and to Rome, but rather here I drew it to Hamburg, but we could include in that particular nexus places like Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt, and possibly even Leipzig with its book fair later on. The institutional self-images are ports, fairs, and stock exchanges. This is a new capitalist, entrepreneurial, and modern Europe. And the othering here is now anything that is to the south of this particular bubble. So we see a gradual shrinking of the European bubble that considers itself superior to the rest of the world. And it means that we have a nesting set of peripheries which come into play while the European bubble shrinks over time. The various nesting peripheries we see are Europe south of the Alps. That is the most modern one. Nowadays, even in European Union affairs, there is the Northern Eurozone against the Southern Eurozone. People don't really trust the economists and the bankers in Greece and in Italy and in Spain, where the euro is weaker. So there is that old Weberian distinction between north of the Alps and south of the Alps. Of older date, from the heyday of a Western European self-image on the axis Rome to London, we have the peripheries of the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkan Peninsula, Central and Eastern Europe, Ireland, the Celtic Fringe generally, and subarctic Europe, that is to say Norway and northern Sweden. And then the oldest other we have from right back into the Middle Ages are the trackless steppes of Russia and Turkey and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, one thing to give away the conclusion I'm working towards is this. In the course of the 19th and the 20th century, all these peripheries become romantic. So the big counterpart to the shrinking of a European core is the romanticization of all its peripheries. Now, I said I was going to use actor network theory. I want to give a few book titles as not as illustrations, but also as, I think, nudge moments when a discursive articulation took place that actually marked a difference. It marked a transition. So one such a book that marks a transition in my three gradual stages of the condensation of Europe is Giorgio Vasari, The Lives of the Painters, which he writes in 1550, and which we may safely say historiographically is one of the first histories that is predicated on the idea of progress. Things are getting better all the time. What Vasari traces is the fact that each pupil surpasses his masters. If you do a full text search to the word surpassing, you see that this is the celebration of the Italian Renaissance by itself. We are the guys who bootstrapped ourselves out of the darkness of the Gothic Middle Ages because each pupil surpassed his masters. From Giotto to Leonardo, this is the rise of culture. So this incredible celebration of improvement is a paradigm that I think was first formulated in Vasari's Lives of the Painters. And it's very interesting to trace in Vasario the art critical notions of imitatio and emulatio. These become household words, and they're all over Tarde, and I think they're all over the notion of diffusionism and all over the notion of synchronism, but they mean very specific things. And they do mean, for instance, that progress is made by a constant polarity between convention and innovation. At the core are the established masters, and they define how it should be done. But then there is the younger generation, which in their emulation not only imitates the masters, but can go beyond them. And this idea of a progressive improvement in culture is, I think, first put into currency by Vasari and taken over in very many places. A very important key text doing a similar thing at the end of the 17th century is Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, where a totally new view of the universe and its physical structure is proposed. And Newton famously says that if he could see further than most people, it was because he stood on the shoulders of giants. And by those giants, he meant Copernicus and Galilei. So he has this idea also of learning from the past and going beyond the past and innovating further. And standing on the shoulder of giants is a commonplace, which was also used by Blaise Pascal. When Pascal wrote his treatise on the vacuum, Nature abhors a vacuum, élevé jusqu'à un certain degré où nos devanciers nous ont portés, nous nous trouvons au-dessus d'eux. C'est de là que nous pouvons découvrir des choses qu'il leur était impossible d'apercevoir. So the whole trope, the meme, if you like, of standing on the shoulders of giants and is taken over from Vasari to the realm of science at a moment when the practical application of Newtonian physics led to maps, to navigational aids, and to things and to a toolkit that was indispensable in establishing the colonial rule over the rest of the world. Finally, just a little bit later, we get another tipping point marked by another set of books this time. I refer to the Querelle des Anciens et des Modernes, which was formulated by a lot of French critics in the late 17th century. I'm here showing Perrault, the Parallèle des Anciens et des Modernes, and it was taken over by Jonathan Swift in his battle of the books between the ancient and modern books. And we see now that modernity becomes a self-appellation. People who can surpass, not just emulate, but even go beyond what Aristotle and the classics knew, they are the moderns. And from that moment onward, we are in a paradigm where the Enlightenment self-defines as being modern, better even than classical antiquity. That's what the phrase modern means from around 1700 onwards. And that it's almost tantamount with enlightenment. Enlightenment and modernity are very elastically linked concepts. Now, these three books that I've shown are all of them moving on that axe from Florence to Paris to London. This is where a Western Eurocentrism crystallizes. Where does that leave the periphery? Peripheries, as Matthias very aptly said, are relative. We see three bubbles where Europe condenses from a post-classical Christendom Europe to a Weberian Protestant work ethic Europe. And as Europe shrinks in its core area, the peripheries get more and more inclusive. So Europe as a chronotope is scalar. This spatiality condenses, becomes more and more tightened towards Northwestern Europe, whereas the historicity modernizes, becomes more and more predicated on a dynamic present evolving into a future. And so the peripheries that are left behind by this chronotope, where condensing spatiality is tantamount to modernizing historicity, means that we have incremental peripheries, that we have a matryoshka periphery. We have dolls within dolls within dolls. Romania is a periphery for the later stages, but it was not yet a periphery for the late Roman Empire. And Poland becomes a periphery later on. And all of these countries are still part of a global center when they look to South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or to Polynesia. So whether you're a periphery or not is a variable framing, and that variability is something that develops over time. I want to conclude by suggesting a few modalities on how people can respond to those conditions of modernity or peripherality. How the chronotope is picked up in self-representations and in which modalities this works. In the core, and certainly as the core shrinks from, if you like, Rome by way of Paris to London and Copenhagen and Amsterdam, there is the complacency of being advanced, the white man's burden. It's triumphalism. It is a total, often social Darwinistic self-celebration as being the most advanced part of humanity. But with that also comes that Unbehagen in der Moderne, to call it like that, this anxiety that, yeah, well, we might be over the top here, the sort of thing that Yeats was already picking up on. And while Kipling is celebrating the white man's burden and the triumphalism of imperial supremacy, Max Nordau is raising the specter of degeneration. It's the anxiety of modernity. It's Yeats saying, hey, this fin de siècle, all these people are decadent. Where are we going? We need to go back to our ancient primitive roots to escape from the future decadence of modernity. So there is an anxiety at the core of the complacency. And thirdly, you can go to a romanticization of the periphery. What I have here is the cover of a whole slew of romance novels in America where women are captured and kidnapped by Native Americans, and they turn out to be real hunks, and it becomes a sort of a sexual wish fulfillment. There is a word for this. It's the sublime. The sublime is the accommodation of anxiety as an aesthetic program. So if your fear of things that are somehow unsettling becomes an aesthetic inspiration, that is the sublime, that's erhabene. That is how Burke and Kant theorize it. And it's the thrill of being outside your comfort zone. Maybe to return to the primitive is outside the comfort zone of modernity, but it's part of an anxiety. You're afraid of it, but the fear is also somehow pleasant and aesthetically pleasing, and that Aufhebung that is in a way a sublime romanticization of the periphery. And of course, we all know how also the European peripheries have been romanticized by escapist literature and art from the core. How does that look if you are in the periphery, if you feel that you are part of the periphery? Well, one response could be, we need to catch up. We are belated. This has already been very ably addressed in the earlier talks this evening. So here is the Fish book, a Bulgarian primer which tried to spread literacy to Bulgarian school children in the 1820s. It's an attempt to apply the Enlightenment to a place in Ottoman Europe where it had had no room yet. So we catch up with modernity. And we see a typical Enlightenment gesture coming a little later, but motivated by the same things and by a certain spatial anxiety where we need to catch up. Modernity can also be contested, as it was in Ireland. Here is a symbol for Sinn Féin, the political party that was inspired by the poetry of Yeats. Sinn Féin means we by ourselves, that is to say, outside England. We don't want to catch up with England. England is decadent. We want to do it differently. We want to go a separate way. Ireland will follow a different path to modernity than England. And you contest whether modernity is one size fits all. And thirdly, that anxiety of being backward can also be turned into an agenda of the sublime, something romantic. We get a type of palingenetic primitivism. You celebrate the extent to which you are not modern. And that is very close to fascist art, to Yeats's heroics. What I have here is a Turkish television series. These television series were all made when Turkey failed to become a member of the European Union, and they certainly started celebrating how really they were Central Asian warriors and that they were part of a Turanian, primitive, tribal, nomadic culture. So everything that Europe was not, the most ancient other that fell outside the European frame, is now becoming a glorification of how Turkey wants to see its own tough, palingenetic and semi-fascist roots. I come to the end of my talk. What I want to stress is that being in the core or being in the periphery is historically variable. And anybody can see himself as being part of a periphery. For instance, I can say I'm from a rustic province of Holland, so I'm not really Dutch, I'm not really Amsterdam, so I'm a backward peasant, like a Bavarian in Germany. But hey, I'm in Holland. You cannot be more central in the world than being part of Northwestern Europe. So you can always frame yourself whichever way you like. And I think the very intriguing, challenging thing about synchronism is the fact that nobody is either wholly a core or wholly a periphery. And what we get is, in the semi-periphery, an uncertainty about what it means to be advanced. It's not even an anxiety. It is, what are we supposed to live up to? I have here the poster for a Ceausescu era Romanian movie and Hungarian participants in some sort of a nomadic Olympics held in to celebrate the primitive roots of the Magyars, and Cuchulainn you saw. People have mixed feelings about modernity. The anxiety is both a jealousy, a desire to buy into it, and a rejection of a game that was made with the rules stacked against you. And roots, where you come from, what the basis is of your cultural background and of your identity, the identity politics are always a very contentious political wedge issue. That is really what I would like to add from Amsterdam to this Bucharest very interesting workshop. Again, I'm very sorry I can't be there, but the ideas can exchange via the clouds in the most beautiful form of synchronism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this story of moving peripheries and centers, which is in fact the history of Europe writ large, and maybe the history of the world as well. There is the added problem that some areas of Europe and the world usually have, which is being situated in multiple peripheries, in liminal areas where not even centers and peripheries are being distinct from one another, are intermingled, communicating, intersecting, and that's the need for clarification of separations between centers and peripheries has always been very problematic for most. Now, playing with time and temporality has been one of the ways of dealing with this. And of course, escaping time, escaping boycotting time and history, as we were saying in interior Romania, was one temptation. Canceling altogether an entire section of Western history, as some Russian extreme thinkers were proposing, that is, deleting about the first millennium, basically, of Western history, saying that was just a farce, a repetition of a chronology that never happened, entirely fictitious, and actually, from this point of view, the entire history and chronology of Western Europe is nonsensical because it superposes itself on the rather short history of Russian civilization. Johannes Fabian, that you mentioned, told me once that he was always passing by the office of Mircea Eliade at Chicago, but he was always tempted to step in and then have a chat with the old master, but ultimately he was always deciding to go and talk to Clifford Geertz. And thus, time and the other was a result of this hesitation and decision. So, thank you very much. I think we had a very interesting start of this conversation. Now, technically, spatially, this is not exactly, this academy was built in 1866 with different technological and, symbolic academic ambitions, and it makes it quite awkward to actually start up. But what I can promise you is that this is just the beginning of something that we are going to pursue as the Bucharest Academia Europaea hub that we started yesterday. And I think of synchronism from this point of view as a series of discussions in which we might, I hope, meet again and then work together towards a series of publications. So that is the offer I have on the table. And I have, because technically, really, doesn't seem to, we are here in this wonderful hall where there is no dialogue. The thing is supposed to be a magisterial ex cathedra pronouncement on something, and they don't care very much about the response. So I think we have to adjust to this constraint. So I would suggest to simply, we can continue the discussions over dinner, and then one day you'll reach us here and will join us for the next dinner. So thank you very much, you close and distant friends. Thank you very much, you all here in the room, and we shall resume our conference tomorrow at 9. So thank you very much once again. It's good shout,